This film focuses on the Korean War to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea, and is adapted from the true experiences of the legendary hero Yang Gensi. History books mention it briefly, unable to fully portray the heroic and tragic scenes of the blind man and lame man traversing the battlefield, nor can they carry the heavy and brutal weight of this history. Now, let us view this history through a cinematic perspective to take a closer look at this period. In January 1947, the nationalist and communist armies fought fierce battles in Zhaozhuang, Shandong. The Qiang troops relied on solid fortifications to stubbornly resist, and the Hua Army's 1st Division, as the vanguard, lost many soldiers. Yet they could not break through their defenses. Yang Gensi was around 20 years old, and the company commander assigned an experienced soldier to follow him closely. After they took up explosive packs, they advanced towards the Qiang troops amid gunfire and shrapnel. 3 enemy firing points were firing intensely. Yang Gensi and Old Wang quickly took cover behind a bunker, then pulled the hand grenade. After destroying the first firing point, they quickly moved forward. Their comrades behind them were responsible for clearing the remaining enemies, covering their advance. When they reached the next bunker, the Qiang soldiers unexpectedly threw a fuse. Old Wang's leg was injured by the blast. Yang Gensi wanted to go forward to check, but Old Wang told him to leave him and continue the mission. Yang Gensi hesitated not, and immediately hugged the explosive pack tightly. Ahead was the second firing point. Yang Gensi observed the enemy while signaling to Old Wang. At the count of 3, Old Wang threw the grenade at the second firing point. Yang Gensi leapt into action at the same moment, heading straight for the 3rd enemy firing point. Bullets whistled past him, but he finally reached behind the bunker safely. Yang Gensi hurriedly pulled the fuse, then stuffed the explosive pack into the gap. As the charge was triggered, the Hua Army troops behind immediately charged towards the Qiang troops. Unexpectedly, an enemy sniper suddenly set up a machine gun on their sniping point. Seeing their commander and several comrades sacrificed, Yang Gensi angrily charged out, recklessly throwing the explosive pack at the sniper position. Finally, he tore through a defensive line in Zhaozhuang, Shandong, paving the way for the PLA to strike the Qiang forces. For his heroic performance in this battle, Yang Gensi was awarded the title of First-Class People's Hero of East China, and in 1950, he was received by Chairman Mao. But honor and responsibility go hand in hand. In June 1950, the Korean War broke out. Although the main battlefield was in Korea, the U.S. military, with its insatiable greed, sought to take advantage of the newly established People's Republic of China, when its national strength and military power were still weak, by expanding the battlefield, dragging China into the conflict, further draining China's resources, and suppressing the development and growth of the new China. Thus, while ruthlessly attacking Korea, the U.S. continued airstrikes on the north side of the Yalu River Bridge and repeatedly bombed border areas, implementing a scorched earth policy. In a critical situation where the lips are cold and the teeth are cold, Yang Gensi's 9th Corps swiftly entered Korea, forming the Volunteer Army to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea. When they arrived in Jinan, it is already November, a time of heavy snow. To support this patriotic battle, many civilians spontaneously sewed new cotton-padded clothes for the soldiers. But even with new clothes, Yang Gensi, the company commander, looked somber. No war is gentle, especially in an era lacking in hot weapons. What is fought is essentially a war of human consumption. The People's Liberation Army needs to brave the cold, hiking across the 2,000-meter high Wolf Forest mountain range to reach the Chosin area in Korea and conduct encirclement and division against the U.S. troops. But relying solely on manpower to walk, the straight-line distance is nearly 400 kilometers, and they also have to avoid enemy aerial reconnaissance. The difficulty is imaginable. All battalion commanders showed worried expressions. In such a difficult situation, Yang Gensi applied to cross the Yalu River first. Beyond that is the Korean territory. The temperature at midnight drops close to -30 degrees Celsius. But Yang Gensi's troops, as the vanguard, had already quietly set out. However, as soon as Yang Gensi entered Korean territory, they encountered a Korean army unit. They were burning, killing, and looting in a nearby village, and probing for the Chinese volunteer army's traces everywhere. After the Koreans entered Korea, they burned, killed, and looted in various villages, trying to help the Americans find the Chinese volunteer army resisting the U.S. and aiding Korea, but they were ambushed by the volunteer army, caught off guard. At this moment, a surviving Korean soldier threw a grenade into the crowd. The new soldier, seeing this for the first time, rushed forward without hesitation. After narrowly escaping danger, the volunteer army quickly ordered the Koreans to retreat, because an American military base was nearby, and they would come rushing over soon. Unexpectedly, in the middle of the night, the Americans bombed the entire village, and the next day, they flew back here for patrols again. But to ensure all ground personnel were dead, the Americans launched multiple missiles, planning to level the village. The volunteer army hiding among the ruins, to avoid exposing their targets, all lay flat on the ground without moving. But the merciless Americans took pleasure in slaughter. Until the American bombers roared away, Company Commander Yang Gensi finally blew his whistle, rushing to his comrades buried under the rubble. He was buried under a pile of bricks, suffering minor injuries, but fortunately survived. They could not stay here long, and immediately advanced toward the American base in Chosin. But in the icy snow, cold, and food shortages became the biggest problems. Many were already hungry, yet their remaining food was barely enough to fill their stomachs. Major Smith of the U.S. Marine Corps quickly sensed the volunteer army's intentions. He immediately reinforced his troops, trying to prevent the volunteer army from advancing further into Chosin. This was November 21, 1950, when Korea faced an unprecedented cold winter in 50 years. The temperature had dropped below -40 degrees Celsius, and the cold wind was raging. The Yalu River had frozen over, and reinforcements could only hold on to each other's shoulders, moving like an ant colony winding forward. Once this situation stops, they will quickly freeze to death. Yang Gensi's troops can only march non-stop, walking through ice and snow all night. By daybreak, many people's feet are frostbitten, their exposed skin cracked and bleeding. But they have no medicine at all, and no matter how painful, they can only endure. Yang Gensi knows, if they continue, these wounded soldiers will surely die. So he discusses with the instructor. He wants to leave all the wounded behind, waiting to meet with the main force from the rear. But the wounded spontaneously gather together, demanding to fight and die with the vanguard troops. However, the fierce battlefield far exceeds their imagination. The U.S. military has first-class aircraft. The Army is equipped with cannons, tanks, and machine guns. And our volunteer Army only has old rifles, and not everyone can be guaranteed a gun. So this is a life-and-death struggle with vastly unequal strength. To blow up the U.S. tanks, the demolition squad soldiers can only carry explosive packs, climb tanks with their bare hands, but they end up blown to pieces. Seeing this, the disabled old squad leader immediately rushes forward and throws an explosive pack onto a tank. But before he can pull the fuse, he is shot into a sieve and rolls down. Faced with the strong offensive of the U.S. troops, he resolutely pulls out the detonator. Just as the red flag is about to fall, a black hand suddenly extends. Then he grabs the flagpole firmly and holds the red flag steadily on his shoulder. Seeing this, the U.S. soldiers are deeply shocked. They take off their hats to show their respect. But then he raises his gun, aiming at this Chinese volunteer. This is a true scene from the Battle of Little High Ridge during the Korean War. Just a few days ago, the Chinese volunteer army relied on bark and snow to step onto the Korean battlefield in -40 degrees Celsius cold. But the snowstorm grew more intense. When the wind howled, the soldiers quickly crawled on the ground, waiting for the strong wind to pass before continuing forward. Under such harsh conditions, 3rd Company led by Yang Gensi finally arrived on November 25, 1950, at the pre-ambush position in the Changjin area. Here, a main U.S. force was stationed. After a brief rest, the 58th Volunteer Army launched a surprise attack, beginning to encircle the U.S. troops. A Chinese-made bullet whistled past U.S. Army Division Commander Smith and shot steadily into the steel plate beside him. Smith was incredulous. In such harsh conditions, the U.S. snow vehicles had already ceased operations. Yet the Chinese Volunteer Army, relying only on their legs, crossed 800 miles of cold mountain areas, directly attacking the core of the U.S. position in the mountain valley. Moreover, the Volunteer Army also blocked the only pass out of the mountain for the U.S., Little High Ridge, preparing to exhaust the U.S. weapons with manpower and drag them to death in the mountains. U.S. Major Miles immediately volunteered, requesting to lead troops to break through Little High Ridge and retake the lost East Hill position. But the Reconnaissance Company of the Volunteer Army quickly discovered the intentions of this force. Early the next morning, Yang Gensi led the 3rd Company to set out. Soon after, they engaged in fierce combat with the U.S. troops led by Miles at Xiaogaoling. The U.S. military used the most advanced machine guns of the time, while the Volunteer Army only had old rifles, which often jammed. The Volunteer Army divided into 3 directions, taking turns firing, luring the enemy deeper, then firing at close range and capturing their equipment. Miles, noticing the increasing intensity of the Volunteer Army's firepower, became furious. In the first confrontation, though the U.S. troops fled in panic, the Volunteer Army lost 32 soldiers. Yang Gensi was silent for a moment, then continued to deploy a new round of tasks. From the moment they set out, they held the belief of sacrificing for the country. Every shot they fired here was to ensure there would be no more gunfire in their homeland. Every soldier who sacrificed here was for future generations to have no war. Then Yang Gensi took off his hat and placed it not far ahead. Just as the flag was planted, the U.S. military brought in dozens of artillery guns and bombarded the Volunteer Army's trenches wildly. The volunteer soldiers hiding nearby quickly jumped into the trenches to defend after the shelling stopped. Sure enough, soon after, the U.S. troops issued an attack order. But when the U.S. troops reached halfway up the mountain, they realized what they saw earlier was not a person, but an empty hat. They had been tricked. At this moment, Yang Gensi blew the attack whistle, thinking it was a successful defense, but the U.S. quickly brought in bombers, locked onto the Volunteer Army's position, and dove down. The U.S. airstrikes combined with ground artillery fire for the under-equipped Volunteer Army was absolute force-crushing. Even more deadly, their ground combat units launched an attack afterward, and the only hardcore weapon the Volunteer Army had was a heavy machine gun. The U.S. also deployed jet fighters to carry out ruthless fire attacks. Under the fierce shelling, only 2 members of the 3rd Company remained. Seeing the red flag hit and about to fall, the sniper still held his ground, immediately grabbing the flagpole, the red flag representing the spirit and fighting will of the Chinese Volunteer Army. Soldiers may fall, but the spirit of courageously moving forward and defending the country to the death must never fall.
老杨，在小沟里上等着我的冲锋号。
山之战不易，祖国一对为亲情。可是不管怎样也改变不了我的中国心。